Hi, and welcome to a new video of this MOOC. In this video, we are going to continue the implementation of our tic-tac-toe simple page application, including a connection to a backend service that will allow us to retrieve a real JSON with the state of a previously started game in order to load it in our board when the user clicks on the continue option of the navigation bar. As always, that we are going to use the HTTP client feature of Angular, we have to import the HTTP client module in the application module, and then, as it is recommended, I'm going to create a new service that will encapsulate every feature related with the HTTP client. So in this case, I'm going to create a new service in which I will implement the get call that will retrieve the saved data from a backend service. In order to get this saved data in this MOOC, I'm going to use this service, the api.myjson.com, in which I can save any JSON I need for testing, development, and so on. So as you can see here, I have created in this service a JSON with a status for our application, and I can access it performing a get to this URL. Okay, so I'm going to copy it in order to include it in my code later. But the first thing I'm going to do is to import the HTTP client module in my application module. So I'm going to go here to the application module of my application, and I'm going to import the HTTP client module from Angular, common HTTP. I'm going also to include this to the list of modules I need in the application. So here I have to include the HTTP client module. Okay, and with this I have included this module as one of the available modules in my application. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is to create this HTTP service in order to encapsulate every function related with a connection to a backend. So using the command line interface tools of Angular, I'm going to generate here generate a new service that I'm going to call HTTP. Okay, but I'm going to call it my HTTP in order to be clear that it's just a service in which I'm going to include my logic. Okay, so now in this service that is created here, my HTTP service, I'm going to include the connection or the method in order to retrieve the data from this service we have just seen. Okay, so I'm going to include here the HTTP client in order to be able to inject it in the constructor. So I'm going to import HTTP client again from Angular core. So here Angular core Angular common HTTP, and now I can inject here HTTP client in the constructor. Okay, so with this I have it created in my, I'm going to put here private in order to be able to access it, and now I'm going to create a new method that is called getSavedGame that I will use in order to retrieve the data from the backend service. So I'm going to use this HTTP client.get, and here I will include the URL of the service you have just seen. So calling to this or subscribing, because remember you have to subscribe because this returns an observable, return the observable, I will be able to get changes to get the result of calling this get to this URL of this service. Now I'm going to modify the game component logic in order to get the data from the backend service using the HTTP service we have just created. So if you remember, in the game component we are currently using a fixed value we put here, and now I'm going to use the method getSaveGame that we have just created in order to get the data from the backend. So the first thing I have to do is to import here the HTTP service we have just created, my HTTP service, from the corresponding file, okay, that is in this case this one, my HTTP service, http.service. Now I can inject it here in the constructor, my HTTP service, that is of type my HTTP service, and now I can call here the method my HTTP service dot get saved game. Remember that this method returns an observable, so I have to subscribe to it, and it will return an state, the saved state for the application. So when I receive the state, I can assign it to the state service state property. Okay, so with this, I'm using the data that I get from the backend service. So you can see here how I have the new game, that is the empty board, and when I click on continue, I'm getting the load game. If I use the DevTools, you can see how in the network functionality, I'm getting, when I click on continue, the value from the service I'm using, as you can see here, HTTPS, API, etc. And this is returning the corresponding JSON with the saved data. With this, we have implemented the basic functionality of our application. However, when connecting to backend services, the requests we send to them can take time on being processing, or even we can have errors, for instance, if the backend service is not available. In these cases, it's very convenient to offer to the user some feedback that explains to him or her what is happening in the application at every moment. In order to do that, I'm going to include in the component a local property indicating the status of the request, and depending on the status, I will display an information message to the user. So when I create the request, I will put the value of this property status to fetching, and I will show a loading message to the user. Then if I receive an OK response from the server, I will change the status to success, and I will render the game as always. However, if I receive an error response from the server, I will put in the status property the text explaining what happens with the request, and I will also display it in the user interface to give this feedback to the user. Okay, so let's include this local property in the game component here. That is a private property named status, and is of type string. This by default will be fetching, okay? But now when I get a successful response from the server, I will assign this dot status to success. And of course, if the user is starting a new game, this will be also success, because I have to render the game board. And now I have to, here in the subscription to the observable, I have to handle the possibility of getting an error in the request. So if I get an error, I will put here in this dot status the text I receive that is here in the error status, status text property of the response. Okay, so now I have here the status in this local property, the status of the request, and I'm going to modify the user interface in order to render the corresponding message. So I will put here a div with the loading message that will be rendered just if the status property is set to fetching. So using an ngIf directive, I will check if a status is equal to fetching. Okay, then if the status is equal to success, I will render the game, and finally, sorry, I have to close here the div, and finally, if the status property is not fetching and is not success, I will render the error message. Say there is, for instance, there is an error in the backend communication, and the error message using interpolation is the one contained in the status property. Okay, so let's test it in the application. As you can see here, when I click on new game, nothing has changed, but if I click on continue, I'm getting this loading message until I receive the response. And also, if I force an error, for instance, modifying here the URL of the request, probably when I click on continue, as you can see, I have here an error response, an error message from the server, in this case internal server error. Okay, so you can see how in this case after loading the response has been an error, and I'm displaying the error message to the user. Okay, so with this we have finished this part of the application, and we have implemented the features for managing routes and backends in our simple page application. See you in the next video. Bye.